Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti, catedrática del Departamento de Estudios de Educación de la Universidad de Columbia Británica, Canadá, y titular de la Cátedra de Investigación en Raza, Desigualdades y Cambio Global del mismo país, examina la relación entre la violencia histórica y sistémica y la insostenibilidad de nuestros hábitos actuales de ser. Se pregunta sobre qué procesos educativos pueden anular nuestro cableado neurológico categórico y nuestras respuestas bioquímicas, es decir, narrativas, miedos, heridas y tendencias narcisistas, o que pueden activar el sentido de responsabilidad, generosidad, humildad y cordura. Todo ello puede abrir posibilidades a nuevos mundos y, en este sentido, a una nueva humanidad que los viva.
Hello, my name is Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. I'm a professor at the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia in Canada. I'm also a Canada Research Chair in Race Inequalities and Global Change. I'm recording this video today from the unceded Indigenous territories of the Kwantlen, the Katsi, and the Stolo First Nations peoples in Canada. So today we're going to be doing an experiment, a head-heart experiment called Education 2048. But before I get to the experiment, I will talk a little bit about my arts and research collective, which is called Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures. So this collective is a transdisciplinary collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and Indigenous knowledge keepers, mainly from Brazil and Canada. It works at the interface of questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence, and questions related to the unsustainability of our current habits of being. It tries to bring together concerns related to racism, colonialism, unsustainability, climate change, biodiversity loss, economic instability, mental health crisis, and intensifications of social and ecological violence. So we work with very heavy themes, and we try to create pedagogical containers where we can have difficult and painful conversations where relationships do not fall apart. So one of the things that we do in the collective is that we prioritize wicked global challenges, how we face wicked global challenges. And wicked global challenges are hyper-complex, multi-layered, interlocked, which means the solution to one thing creates problems in other places. And they involve many unknowns and have longer and uncertain timescales. And we recognize that our formal education does not prepare us well to address wicked challenges and the complexities, uncertainties, ambiguities, pluralities of views and aspirations, the paradoxes, the unequal power relations, and the conflicts that are inherent in these wicked global challenges. We also recognize that if we address wicked global challenges as regular problems, our interventions will tend to reproduce three harmful patterns of simplistic feel-good solutions that may address symptoms but not root causes, paternalistic engagements with marginalized communities, and ethnocentric ideals of justice, sustainability, and change. And our approach is based on a non-Western form of psychoanalysis that is coming from the communities we work with, both in Canada and Brazil, the Indigenous communities. It's a translation of their teachings into something that can land in Western contexts. If we're working from a psychoanalytic pedagogy, we need to understand how our unconscious operates in our learning process. So this pedagogy that we promote, which we call a depth pedagogy, is based on an analysis of 4 denials. So the first denial is the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm. The fact that our comforts, our securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation somewhere else. So if you think, for example, about the minerals that go into the technology that is making it possible for me to record this video and for us to have a connection, these minerals come from communities and are part of exploitative practices that have a cost, and this cost is paid for by the communities that are exploited and that have and also by the environment, right? So this is the first denial. The second denial is the denial of the limits of the planet and the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption at the rate that we are promoting right now. The third denial is the denial of entanglement, which is the denial that we are not separate from each other and from the land, but we're entangled within a living wider metabolism that is biointelligent, that is the planet. And the fourth denial, which is related to the wicked problems, the wicked challenges, is the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the problems that we face, which means that the difficulties that we will need to face together are bigger or larger than what we can imagine. So we have a tendency to look for simplistic solutions that make us feel good and look good, and that may address symptoms, but not the root causes of our collective complex predicament. So we're looking at how education can help us be prepared to hold space for the enormity of the challenges that we will need to face together. And we talk about this SMDA compass. SMDA stands for sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability. And we use the image or metaphor of learning to walk a tightrope between desperate hope and reckless hopelessness. So desperate hope is naive hope, which is looking for a right ideology or a heroic authority or the chosen people or a special practice or a return to a time and place as an anchor for believing that things are going to be okay, things are going to be fine. So that's the hope that many people look for, but that hope actually becomes an obstacle for us to sit together with the difficult things. On the other side, there's reckless hopelessness, which is absolute relativism or hedonism, which is about living just your best life without any accountability. There's also misanthropy there, nihilism, and the banalization of brutality. So learning to walk the tightrope with the compass of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability means learning to show up differently, show up with honesty, not wanting to be rescued from reality. So the idea of being able to be present to the painful and difficult aspects of reality, showing up with humility, not centering oneself in the process and being able to decenter, to disarm, and to disinvest in harmful habits, showing up with humor, and showing up with hyper self-reflexivity. So humor is very important here because as we're dealing with heavy issues, we need a light container to be able to hold this together. And what we mean by hyper self-reflexivity is the idea of being able to trace what drives our thoughts and desires. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So in this tightrope, we have a rod where we have to balance both intellectual rigor and relational rigor. And intellectual rigor means also being open to different forms of rationality, different knowledge systems, different ways of knowing and being. So in that sense, hyper self-reflexivity means asking difficult questions like, to what extent are you reproducing what you critique? Or to what extent are you avoiding looking at your own complicities and denials and at whose expense? What are you doing and what are you doing this for? Who are you accountable to? What is your theory of change? Who is benefiting the most from this work? How wide is the gap between where you think you are at and where you are actually at? Who would be able to help you realize that? And to what extent can you respond in generative ways when your work or self-image are challenged? So we are trying to make these questions a practice that enables us to show up differently to each other when it's the most difficult, when we are really facing issues that normally send people on a spin. So we developed several exercises as part of this pedagogy, and one of them is Education 2048, a head-heart experiment. So I'm going to invite you now to take part in this exercise, and this means that this is an exercise that is neither descriptive or prescriptive. Instead, it intends to clear space and build collective capacity for us to reflect on the role of education in confronting the potential and or likelihood of social and ecological collapse in and or beyond our lifetimes. It also invites us to zoom out, taking a step away from yourself and to observe yourself observing with curiosity and without investing emotionally in the reactions or resistances that may emerge towards the exercise. So if you feel resistance to the exercise, observe it, turn it into your teacher. And then we use those observations to learn more about ourselves and to expand our capacity to sit with difficult and painful things without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, or wanting to be rescued from discomfort. So this is a pedagogy of discomfort. This exercise emerged when the collective was asked to create a presentation about how to imagine education in 2048, 100 years from when the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed. And we felt that what we were being asked to do was just to imagine how schools would look like in 2048. But we wanted to bring to the table something different. We wanted to bring to the table the questions we needed to ask about what we would have to reckon with in the period between now and 2048. So we created an exercise where you are going to be placed already in 2048. And that's how we describe the scenario. So imagine today is the 10th of December 2048, 100 years from the declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the signature, and you are participating in a 3D virtual reality world Skype call with the intent to decide how we should educate our children and ourselves after the devastating impact of the events of the past 30 years, which were caused by human greed, arrogance, stubbornness, and unwillingness to learn from human wrongs. For our consultation, it's important that we remember what education is for, what the past has taught us, what made the difference to get us out of the mess, what we know now, and what we're still being taught. We will review this together before starting our consultation. There are 1 billion people on this call, a third of the world's total population today. We will start by recalling significant events that happened in the last 3 decades. What you will see next is the text of this presentation only. The associated images and videos are now being transferred to your body implants. Blink twice to accept the files. So the period between 2018 and 2027 was marked by an interruption of our dreams of consumerism as prosperity. This period started with school climate strikes. Young people seemed to be aware that the path we had chosen was both violent and unsustainable. They already knew that their generation would not have the same opportunities for social mobility that their parents and grandparents enjoyed, nor the stability and well-being afforded by their class in relatively healthy ecosystems. In 2020, the COVID-19 global pandemic hit, followed by several outbreaks of different strains of the virus. Racial tensions and civil unrest also marked this period, especially in highly divided and volatile countries like Brazil, Hong Kong, UK, and the USA. From 2022, we had a mounting economic crisis, mass unemployment, mass homelessness, mass migration, localized famines, and the intensification of social and racial inequalities. Reactionary populist governments were democratically elected all over the world by harnessing the power of hyperpolitical polarization and fueling antagonism and resentment. Extreme weather, flooding, and catastrophic forest fires became routine. Pollinator populations collapsed globally in 2026. By 2027, alpine skiing was only possible in the Himalayas. In this 10-year period, schools became even more obvious sites of political and economic struggle. Governments in many countries, including the USA and the UK, forbade teachers to talk about racial privilege or the complexities of gender and sexual identities. Teachers were also prohibited to present anti-capitalist perspectives or perspectives that challenged accounts of history authorized by the state. However, despite political disputes, the protection of unrealistic economic interests was still prioritized in the curriculum. At large, schools were still teaching a learner-centered, competencies-based, technology and market-oriented curriculum driven by hyper-individualistic, metropolitan consumerist values and principles. By this time, curriculum examination and school social services had largely been outsourced to private companies. In 2026, a well-known corporation in the US that had been lobbying the government for decades offered a more cost-effective option for online global education and teacher training. They standardized a global curriculum powered by artificial intelligence, causing mass teacher unemployment. The period between 2028 and 2037 was marked by the real threat of human extinction. By 2028, the Amazon forest was down to a third of its size. The remainder teetered on the edge of becoming a biologically inert desert, similar to the exhausted agricultural fields of the US Corn Belt. Ironically, the market share of Jeff Bezos' Amazon company was worth a third of the total global wealth. The average temperature rose 2.47 degrees Celsius across the globe. Previous mitigation efforts had been too little too late. All permanent ice in the Arctic was lost. All permafrost in Siberia also melted, releasing methane and unleashing viruses and fungal strains that we were not immune to or prepared for. We had extensive desertification that led to massive crop failures that, in turn, caused the global food supply chain to break down. This resulted in the worst global famine ever experienced. There were also disastrous typhoons, hurricanes, and tsunamis, making large areas uninhabitable. Many people were displaced. Borders were closed and militarized because of mass migration. Most states failed to sustain their welfare safety net, and many people were left without any government support for healthcare, sanitation, or waste management. Pensions and unemployment benefits also became a thing of the past as systems of wage labor foundered. In mid-human range, future forecasting became impossible. Reactionary dictatorships were installed. Governments used mass surveillance and AI technology wrapped in the rhetoric of maintaining law and order to sweep away civil rights and freedoms and control citizen mobility. Torture and genocide against people and groups perceived as inconvenient increased at an alarming rate and became a normalized extension of police brutality and military tactics. Nuclear and biological weapons were also unleashed in wars. 5 factors contributed to unparalleled loss of human life during this time. Number 1, unprecedented famines. Number 2, major viral and fungal outbreaks. Number 3, a global mental health crisis. And number 4, incurable new diseases caused by combined toxins and microplastics in food and water. Violent civil conflicts, including state-sanctioned violence, terrorism, and police brutality, also played a huge part in this. Needless to say that Black, Indigenous, and racialized populations were disproportionately targeted by state-sponsored violence and suffered the most in these events due to unparalleled levels of inequality. It's important to acknowledge that many of these people and communities had been experiencing these levels of trauma for generations and had been sounding the alarm for ages. But most of us were indifferent and focused on trying to sustain our way of life in spite of all evidence that it was deadly. Online schooling became unviable in 2033, and the corporation that had taken over global online learning went bankrupt in 2034. Although the executives received very generous payouts, bonuses, and severance packages prior to dissolution, the global economy completely collapsed in 2036, a year after Elon Musk started a human colony on Mars. The period between 2038 and 2047 was a period where we finally accepted that we were part of the problem and that we needed to get our act together, grow up, and engage with our messy and painful reality to avoid being wiped out. The Mars colony tragically failed in 2038, destroying our hopes for life on another planet. In 2039, a massive event made us all realize that we had messed up big time. We realized that we were addicted to arrogance, to consumption, to unaccountable autonomy, and to control. We realized that we needed mass rehabilitation. We grasped the gravity of the fact that we were only 3 billion people left on the planet. We understood that we had caused the extinction of 70% of all species and the extinction of life in whole parts of the earth. And we were extremely close to causing our own. We recognized that planet Earth is alive and we are part of its metabolism, not the center of the world or a special species. We also worked out that humanity is capable of both horrendous and wonderful things. We started to face our own and others' humanity in all its complexity and to be taught by the human wrongs we had all inflicted upon each other, upon other beings, and upon the planet. Then we all had to learn quickly, collectively, and without schools or moral manifestos, to heal intellectually, emotionally, relationally, economically, ecologically, and politically, to abolish colonial and racial violence, inequality, hierarchies of worth, and separations, to center the earth and decenter our egos, our identities, our human narratives, and our projections, to age and to die in generative ways, to care for everything and everyone rather than compete, to plan, to repurpose technology, to compost, to repair, and to regenerate everything, to prioritize the common good for humans, non-humans, and the planet, to use words and conversations carefully and wisely, with humility and maturity, to own up, to sober up, to clean up, to grow up, to show up, and to exist differently. So today, 10th of December 2048, we convene to decide how to educate our children for human responsibility and accountability, considering the needs of the next 7 generations of humans and non-humans alike. We need our children to learn from human wrongs, from the violence and unsustainability caused by humanity, from our repeated mistakes of the past so that they can only make different mistakes in their future. From the day children are born, their education should prepare them to become healthy and wise elders and good ancestors for all relations. We cannot afford to repeat history. Today we decide how to do this together as a planet-wide human and non-human family. So this is the scenario. And with this scenario, when we run the workshop, we have 2 types of questions, dipping in questions and diving deeper questions. Dipping in questions include, what do you think was the event that made us realize we needed another way to coexist? Who were the people who survived, who perished, why? What was rehabilitation like? What did we fail to learn up to 2018 that could have prevented the most harmful events of the next 2 decades? Diving deeper questions include, what effective responses emerged during this exercise? Anxiety, sadness, resistance, relief, exhaustion, excitement, hope, hopelessness, anger, frustration, defensiveness, loss, grief, something else, something not articulable. Did you witness a desire for hope in the continuity of our current system and reassurance that everything would be okay? And the collapse described in the scenario has already happened for many people and other species. In many cases, the collapse they face on a daily basis is what maintains the comforts, enjoyments, securities, and conveniences of those of us who have so far been protected from it. How do you relate to your own complicity in violence and unsustainability? And what sensations emerge in your body when you reflect on this, when you have to reflect on our own culpability? For the things that have been described so far. So we did this exercise with many people, especially educators in several conferences, and we also tried to map, create a cartography, a map of the responses that we have had, and we mapped them in 4 clusters. And there are different ways to map this. This is only one of them that I think raises some questions that are useful for education, which is what we're going to see next. So the cluster of responses that we call cluster 1 are people who feel relief with the exercise, with the articulation of the catastrophic unfolding of events. And then they also report anger at our collective inability to see this already happening, excitement that we're finally talking about it, and skepticism in relation to the awakening presented as a conclusion. Cluster 2 expresses surprise with the exercise, anxiety with the unfolding catastrophe, hope with the conclusion, and concern for the length of time it could take for solutions to be found. Cluster 3 presents resistance to the exercise, even opposition to the existence of an exercise like this. It also presents fear of hopelessness caused by the exercise, despair with the scenario, overwhelm with the complexity of the situation, and denial of complicity in the problems presented. In cluster 4 is a cluster of bewilderment, where you really stop and you have everything that was coming before interrupted. So people described feelings that were described as an open heart surgery or a lead ball in the stomach. So I'm putting it here, putting this cartography here to show how these responses, when we started doing this exercise, we did it last year, the responses were more or less 20% in cluster 1, 40% in cluster 2, and I would say then 30% in cluster 3 and 20% in cluster 4. Now, when we did this exercise in the summer, this has changed also because we did it in Canada and we're going through, specifically here in British Columbia, this season of heat domes and wildfires. So people are starting to need to sit with these issues in a more urgent way. So the response changes with what's happening around people, specifically in relationship to events caused by the climate crisis. And for me, as an educator, this exercise also raises some questions for education. I've listed some of the questions here. The first one is, could education as we know it equip humanity to hold space for difficult, painful, and overwhelming issues and conversations away from desires to be rescued and coddled and without demanding quick fixes? Could education as we know it be reoriented away from metropolitan consumerist individualism? Could education as we know it prepare us to show up with maturity, sobriety, humility, and accountability as we face storms together without hurting or killing each other, or further harming or fully destroying the planet and other non-human beings that are part of it? Could education as we know it equip us to face the potential or likelihood of the end of the world as we know it? Or do we need something else? So, with these concerns, what I will leave you with is where we're at right now. So, when we created this exercise, we never thought that we would be actually witnessing something extremely serious happening, and it's happening in the country where I'm from. It's happening in Brazil, and it's happening with communities that are part of my family. So I will leave you with the Last Warning campaign. This is a campaign of the Federation, it's an educational campaign of the Federation of the Hunikuí Indigenous Peoples of the state of Acre. They are considered one of the groups that are the guardians of the Amazon rainforest. And this campaign is about Brazil, the Brazilian Congress and the Brazilian Supreme Court voting now to change the constitution, to take away indigenous lands, to cancel indigenous rights, and to open up the Amazon and other environmentally protected areas to mining, logging, and predatory agribusiness. The Arts and Research Collective, Gesturing Towards the Colonial Futures, was called to support this campaign because the communities that are behind this campaign are the communities that are research partners in Brazil. And it's heartbreaking to see what's going on at the moment in the Brazilian context for indigenous peoples. So I will leave you with a song that was a collaboration between one of our students here in Canada and the communities we work with in Brazil. And in the song, you will see that the communities themselves explain why it is important to witness what's happening in Brazil right now.
Un cuerpo inmenso con huesos rotos y entre silencio noto un cuerpo inmenso con huesos rotos y entre silencio noto que somos adictos al poder, al placer de no ver que mi abundancia es culpable de tanta escasez. Para sanar la herida hay que llorar el llanto de un mundo que se quema, de un mundo que no llena. Para sanar la herida que muy dentro ya arde, hay que mover el canto, hay que querernos tanto. Un mundo que se quema, un cuerpo que se inunda, hay que mover el canto, hay que querernos tanto, hay que mover el llanto, hay que querernos tanto, hay que. No es de derecha ni a la izquierda, al fondo está la raíz, en las manos que tejen y sanan, las que siembran el maíz y el plátano, la papa, la resistencia, la resiliencia. El café, el cuidado, la tierra, las aguas y las sangres, los vientos. Un cuerpo inmenso con huesos rotos y entre silencio noto que somos adictos al poder, al placer, a no ver que mi abundancia es culpable de tanta escasez.
So thank you for inviting me to speak today, and I hope our paths cross one day. Thank you.
Interpelar el mundo educativo formal, imaginar una humanidad consciente, trascendente y en paz requiere indagar sobre la posibilidad de sanar nuestro dolor individual y colectivo, sin culpas, parálisis, transferencias o apegos. Invita a preguntarse cómo serían el diálogo, la horizontalidad y la solidaridad más allá de los límites imaginativos de los sistemas políticos y económicos, del humanismo antropocéntrico y de la separación. Y, finalmente, permitiría encontrar un antídoto contra la indiferencia que esté más allá de las convicciones.